we go. They'll be here online.
No, I'm not worried about it.
All right, we live, Matt? Welcome, good morning to the online folks. Oh, okay. Hopefully you can hear us. Matt's going to get the camera on us, and our teacher is just about ready to teach us. And I want to give a couple of announcements before John comes and starts our session today. First of all, just grateful that John is back with us again. We haven't scared him off, which is wonderful. And I'm grateful for all the work he's been doing and how he's been teaching us and leading us through this very interesting topic. A note that next Sunday, May 29th, is the 5th Sunday of the month. That means we will have a 5th Sunday worship service, one service at 9:30 next Sunday. So one service at 9:30 here in the sanctuary, streamed online as well. That means that our forum will still happen, but will happen after the 9:30 service. So John will be back with us for the forum, but that forum will start about 10:45 next Sunday instead of this regular 9 o'clock time. So still forum, still here, just a little bit later after the 9:30 service, the one service next Sunday. And I think with that, John,
Here I am.
come teach us.
Okay. I'll do what I can. You believe in starting on time? Okay, Kathy, I'm going to have some mention of your questions.
Okay.
So you want to be here to hear what I think the answers are.
Okay.
Hello, Carolyn.
Hello again, John.
Again, we meet again.
We meet again.
Yep. Well, let's see. Better put my glasses on. Can they hear me in there or not? Do you know? No. No. Okay, well, I'll talk quietly then, because you're sitting right in front of me.
No, you got to talk normal because you're being recorded.
I'm being recorded, okay?
So that, and then there's people that are like coming from home.
Yeah?
Maybe right now.
Well, okay, good.
And I told Chief we'll be starting shortly. I told Peter too. Doug should be coming too.
Well, I'd have a cup of coffee, except I can't make it through an hour standing up and talking. I'm not alone, huh?
Sit down. He's the one that has to stand up.
Should we bring you a chair?
Beg pardon?
Should we bring you a chair?
No, I'm fine. I can't think sitting down, I think standing up. Well, I think if you don't mind, Bob, I'll just wait till I see some other company. Yes, sir. Let's see, clock. Well, we were talking about Crucible out there with coffee, and this is the book. And the reason I'm doing it this way, doing this particular forum, is that I really believe that people don't really reckon on the influence of their environment on the kind of people they turn out to be in families or at work. I don't know how many corporations think about the environment that they're setting up, but it's really pretty critical because it makes all the difference and has a big influence. And so thinking about the environment that was Jesus was born into. Here's the book, Crucible of Faith. You'll recall that a crucible is a container that's got a mixture of elements under heat and pressure. And probably everybody in here is old enough to have been in a crucible before. Good morning, Jean.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's the original St. Jude's person.
Well, he's following me pretty close. He's pretty close.
Okay. So anyway, Palestine before the birth of Jesus was a crucible as an area, because it was a place where the Hebrew tradition was intruded upon by one of the followers of Alexander the Great, a Greek. And so what occurred in Palestine in the 200 years before the birth of Jesus was a crucible, or an encounter between the Hebrew original inhabitants, original going back to probably 1000 BC, the original inhabitants and the Greeks, and they thought very different ways of thinking about things, and so the Greeks intruded upon the Hebrew way of thinking, and it made a very big difference. Some of the differences that the Greeks brought were kind of a mystical understanding about things, and Hebrews were not particularly mystical. They were pretty down-to-earth people. All of a sudden, there's an interest in afterlife, an interest in what I call metaphysics, or the larger reality that we live in. The word apokalypto is brought by the Greeks, which means to reveal or disclose, and so things are different as a result of the Greeks impacting the Hebrew culture and Jesus' understanding. And I hope you all have an outline here that you can follow the outline. If you wonder what's going to happen next, read ahead and you can see exactly what I'll be doing next. And so this was the before Jesus book. The after Jesus book is the book after Jesus and before Christianity, which was written by a whole group of scholars that were the people invented the Jesus Seminar. Both the Jesus Seminar and the early Christian Seminar came out of an organization called Westar, W-E-S-T-A-R. And Westar is a group of academics in the area of religion, and a number of people from Westar were the people that wrote before Jesus and after Christianity. And neither one of these books or the ideas in these books were anywhere near where I was in seminary. How about you, Penelope? Were any of the ideas in these two books current in your seminary years?
Not so much.
No.
At one point, early on, I was at Union in New York, and Walter Wink was there. And so he had a lot of progressive points of view. But by and large, no.
No. Well, it wasn't anywhere around when I was there. I went to seminary between 62 and 65, which was a long time ago. And a lot of what is known now was unthinkable or unheard of at that particular point in time. One of the interesting parts about this Jesus, after Jesus, before Christianity, is that when we really think about the historical past, we generally take along a lot of our current understandings and take them and put them back in history. And so the Jesus Seminar, in writing this book, decided to read history forward and not backward, which means they eliminated all the assumptions of the Christianity that I would know or the Christianity that preceded our time, and went back and looked at what happened in Palestine after the death of Jesus de novo. They didn't take any assumptions. They just went to work and did all the research they could do to find out what kind of a place it was and how the Jesus movement got underway. And you want to bear in mind that the first 2 centuries, which this book is talking about, wasn't talking about an institution. They have one whole chapter that talks about why Christianity was not even a title that was used in the first 200 years. There was no institutional form, no buildings like this, no people like me, no particular agreement about what was the proper way to understand Jesus in terms of what was written. The writings were being done at that particular time, considerable debate among people about what Jesus was all about. And last week Kathy H. came up with some questions that I couldn't hear. And bear in mind, I'm a little older than when I was here, a lot older. And as a consequence, my hearing isn't what it ought to be, and I couldn't quite get everything you said. But we had an email conversation back and forth since the last session, and I think I finally got her questions down, so I'm going to do a brief word about them because we could spend probably 2 sessions just looking at her questions. And if you have an outline in front of you, the questions are on the outline. Number D under 1. And the first question Kathy asked, were there similar distinctions between the followers of the anointed? That's what the early Christian people, or the followers of Jesus, were generally called, followers of the anointed. Any difference between them and the Romans and the Jews? I think the biggest difference between the followers of Jesus probably turned out to be the Hebrews, because they were the ones that probably first of all recognized that what the Jesus followers were thinking about was somewhat different than the Hebrews that inherited that and then the Romans. Of course, the Romans got anxious when it looked like the Christians were going to be a movement that was going to challenge the Roman Empire, and nobody challenged the Roman Empire. So I think the answer to the question was that the more that the followers of Jesus began to be recognized, the more the Jews had a difficulty with them, primarily because Hebrews in that time, and to some extent now, is not a thought form, it's a practice. And as a result of the practice, Hebrews believed if you got the practice right, you were going to be okay. And people like Paul said, no, the practice is not primary. The faith is primary. You can't win God's favor by practicing the right kinds of things. And I believe that to be true. I believe that the relationship between God and human beings isn't so much a matter of what you believe. It's a matter of being open to what God is going to do for you. So that's my first answer. The second question is, did teaching about loving one another distinguish the followers of the anointed from the Jews? Yes, I think probably to some extent. You never can tell exactly who's going to love other people. And sometimes people that are in churches are not very loving, and sometimes people who don't go near churches are loving. So I think it's really hard to say. It's hard to say whether loving one another was something that Jews probably would not have disagreed with, but it was not a part of their belief system. Number 3, do I see in current less institutional Christianity a straight line forward to the application of faith to life? In other words, as Christianity becomes less institutional, and believe me, it's going to, it already has in a lot of places, I sometimes think that one of the downsides of institutional religion is that people get habituated. Same page, same prayer book, same Sunday morning, same people like me standing in front. And that being habitual, which is a characteristic of institutions, is sometimes diminishes the ability of people to look beyond what is just habitual and familiar to see what is really more important. Does God reward correctness in life or after life? That's an interesting question, isn't it? In life or after life? I could probably do a whole series on afterlife and what afterlife is all about, but my own personal, where I stand right now, is I think that what happens in afterlife is the same experience of Christ as it is in life, only that's all you have after life. You have alternatives here in life. And so there's room to be diverted from the experience of Christ and to miss it altogether. But in life after life, there's nothing else there. That's what you get. You get the presence of the risen Jesus, so to speak, in afterlife. Now, I don't know what you think about afterlife, but if you want to know about it, then think a little bit about what encountering Jesus was like, And I think that's what you get. In fact, I think that's all that's there. So it's important to think about how you get along with Christ, because you're going to have to get along with Christ for a very long time someday, like in eternity. Okay, now we're back to this week. Would you like to do a rejoinder to any of that, Kathy? Or your questions?
You teased out a few more questions, so which is great.
She's got more questions. Would you sit in back, please? Kathy comes with questions. Okay, here we are. And I think that this is a pretty important series of chapters in this book, because I think, for me anyway, the most important part of this book had to do with chosen or experimental families. And the short way to talk about that is that what happened after Jesus and before Christianity was the gradual emergence across the Roman Empire of a particular form of community which were called families of the anointed. And the book is really good on that. As a matter of fact, we're starting off with a chapter for today in a section which is called Experimental Families. And experimental families were very important apparently in the Roman Empire and the Roman system, but they were a particular kind of family. First of all, they weren't chosen, you were born into them. And each one of us was born into a family, so you don't necessarily get to choose the family you're born into. But in the Roman world, that particular family form persisted and endured throughout life, and the head of that was always a male head of the household. And that was probably a little bit like it was in our experience up to probably 20 or 30 years ago. But a lot of that has changed now. A lot of that has changed because families are much more fluid, I think, than they were at one time. My wife and I had breakfast with a granddaughter just yesterday morning. And she's our youngest granddaughter. She's 23 years old. And I thought to myself, now what can a 23-year-old be like at breakfast anyway? Well, boy, it was the most interesting breakfast I've had in a long time. And she had, at 23, had a familiarity with talking about things seriously and in depth than anything I was like when I was 23 years old. I grew up in a family that was, the culture of the family was intelligent, well-educated, and spoke and talked on a very superficial level. But this 23-year-old, she did a deep dive almost immediately at our breakfast, and it was a very entertaining and exciting breakfast because we talked about more than just where she's going to work and where she went to college and what she was thinking about. We had a conversation about her family and the ins and outs of her mother, who is our daughter, and what that was like growing up with our daughter. We weren't surprised. But I was surprised to hear that she was thinking about that out loud with grandparents who had assured her that this conversation is going no further than this table. You got to assure people about that if you really want to get the truth about things. Otherwise, you never know where the stories are going to go. And the more the stories go and the further out they go, the more complicated things can get family-wise. You may have experienced that. So I always assure family members when I'm talking with them that this is going to go no further than right here. Marilyn and me, and it'll be talked about between the two of us, but it's not going to be talked about elsewhere. This is a confidential conversation. At any rate, Roman families were headed up by a paterfamilias, a male-dominated head of the family, and that head of the family reflected Roman views and Roman attitudes. And as usual, I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the book because this is all new to me. The family this chapter uses the word family to refer to the social arrangement that lay at the center of ancient Mediterranean life. But a family had a very different set of meanings in the ancient world than it did now. And certainly, when you think about the the father being the dominant arbiter of families, that really isn't, I think, the way it is now. Now, maybe it is in some families, but that's going to, paterfamilias is really going to in for a hard ride for a while. The paterfamilia in his own kind of household was in his own kind of a household god. Yeah, Daddy is God. And gods filled the Roman household, overseeing every act and aspect. The paterfamilias, taking the role of household priest, led the household in performing devotions to various gods of the family and ensuring prosperity, household honor, and the continuation of family life. The paterfamilias was in charge of the maintenance of the moral order of the household. That's the father. Each member of the household was required to perform specific duties, virtues we find reflected in the writings of some of the communities of the anointed. And the book here really takes a good hard look at some of the gospel writings and notes the way in which even in the gospel writings there seemed to be a diversion from the standard Roman family. There was something about Jesus that challenged the Roman paterfamilia form of family. And so, okay. Now looking a little bit at the chosen, followers of the anointed families. Those belonging to the anointed use the primary building block of social life, the household, to define what this belonging essentially meant. And here it uses, there's a not a well-known, very brief writing in the New Testament called Philemon. And Philemon was a slave who was befriended by Paul, and he escaped his family, and he was talked by Paul into going back to his original family. And as a consequence, Philemon has got a lot of implications about what an anointed family was like. Philemon may have been a paterfamilias patron or co-leader with members of his family, but he was not the ultimate authority. He was not the master of the assembly. He was subject to a household himself. The reference to God as Father is not so subtle challenge to Philemon's concept of his own social power and a challenge to the emperor as father. You see, the Roman emperor was seen as kind of the father of the Roman Empire, the lawgiver, the one in charge, the arbiter of values and understandings. And because that was the way the emperor modeled his relationship to the empire, that was the way the male head of a household was modeled in terms of being in charge of a Roman household. And the way in which these Jesus groups, these followers of the anointed, or Jesus clubs is a good way to put it, operated, and first of all, they weren't given, they were chosen. You had to choose to belong to something like that. Just like, I suppose people used to go to the same church as their parents, and therefore it was kind of handed down, but that's not true now at all. My goodness sakes, I never went back to as a matter of fact, I led my family in a different direction because the family I was born into had not much to do with the church at all, which was really surprising. And so they followed me into the Episcopal Church because a friend in elementary school invited me to go to his Episcopal Church when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. So I had an early start, and it was chosen by me. There was no church or religious affiliation that my family had that I had to inherit. So I've chosen my churches all the way along. And so the writings of Jesus peoples in the first 2 centuries tell stories of families. These stories describe factual and chosen household, holding cultural and countercultural modes of belief in tension. And so there was a lot of tension in these Jesus families between what was traditional in the Roman Empire and what was fresh and new by being an experimental or a chosen family. The language of family declares both social legitimacy and social nonconformity. And so these chosen families were not in conformity with the paterfamilia or traditional families in the Roman Empire. So there was a real break there. in the Roman Empire, you were expected to belong to your original family all the way along. But for people who were followers of Jesus, they chose groupings that were totally different than what they had been handed and given at the beginning of life. This language of family was so important to the ways in which early communities of the anointed experienced their relationships to one another, because it was the same language people used to think about the social life under empire as a whole. Calling the leader of a Jesus association as father, as many associations did, has specific social consequences. Was a father a paterfamilia, head of a household, or was new chosen family standing in tension with the standard understanding of familias? Paul's greeting to various Jesus associations, that's who Paul was interacting with. They were congregations. They were, when you read about Philippians or you read about Colossians or certainly Corinthians, you were reading about a chosen experimental family, not the traditional Roman families, but you're learning about a different kind that people who were followers of the anointed had chosen for themselves. And if you don't have to read very far in Corinthians where you hear about a woman named Chloe. Chloe was the head of their family, and that was unheard of in the Roman Empire under more traditional families. So the head of a family, a Jesus family, wasn't necessarily a male who operated in charge of everything. And in the case of Corinthians, it was a lady named Chloe. And Paul was writing Chloe because Chloe was in contest with a lot of other groups in that chosen family, and Paul was trying to get them back together again, probably under Chloe. Calling the leader of a Jesus association father, as many associations did, has specific social consequences. Was that father a paterfamilias, a head of a household, or was this new chosen father standing in tension with a standard understanding of a paterfamilia? Paul's greeting to various Jesus associations at the conclusions of his letter to the Romans suggests that some associations met his household in which the paterfamilia was not even a member of the group. In other words, the person who was in charge of your Roman family wasn't even a part of the Jesus family. He hadn't chosen that particular association. How did that association work out for itself? In the midst of their earthly push and pull, these associations consistently displaced the ultimate patriarch, the emperor God, with the God of the Judeans. And so these chosen experimental families of the anointed were in some contrast to the main social arrangement of the Roman Empire. And so a tension begins to develop between Roman Empire families and chosen experimental families. The writer of Ephesians called God the Father from whom every fatherhood under sky on earth is named. The displacement of emperor also would have not gone without social consequences. Family is a thorny, ever-changing concept. It is everywhere in the writings of the communities of the anointed, and we cannot understand the experiments in group belonging in these communities without taking a look at it. And then it takes a long look at the Gospel of Matthew and the way in which Matthew tends to break a lot of the traditions that the author would have probably inherited when he was a little boy. Under a household lens, the Gospel of Matthew can and must be read as an ultimate experiment with family, an experiment that in many ways challenges the prevailing social mode of paterfamilias and the patriarchal descent. So there's a tension that grew between these families of the anointed and the standard traditional Roman family. And that tension became a part, I'm sure, of the first 200 years of the Jesus movement. Jesus is an adopted son. His mother and his adopted grandmothers were women who had to endure social violence, take risks, express vulnerability to survive. And only 4 of these women are named, 5 recognized. This writing itself, adopted by various Jesus groups, would have had a profound impact on the group belonging and organization. It is just one example of the many forms of experimental families we find across these diverse communities of the anointed and related groups in the first 2 centuries. And the next chapter is interesting because the chapter is entitled Join the Club. Join the club. Chosen families, and we're now on chapter 11, belonging to an association. And this is talking about some of the ways in which Roman families, and Chloe's people had different kinds of rules for what you did when you belonged. And there were rules in the early anointed families, just like there were rules in the Roman families, but the rules were somewhat different. Chosen family was one way in which Jesus groups organized themselves. Another prominent organization form was the association or club. Belonging to an association was a critical way for people to find security, safety, and social place, especially for members of the underherd, the enslaved, day laborers, migrants from across the empire, among others. Exploring what these clubs were, how they were created, and how they functioned in the first and second centuries of the Common Era was help us understand how Paul established his anointed associations in particular. So Paul was a big organizer of experimental families, of Jesus clubs. That's a part of what he did. Paul would arrive in a certain place, find out who the interested leaders were in town, get to know them, begin to associate with them, and begin to draw on these early members and their friends to join the club. And so Paul, in many ways, was kind of a club organizer. I never thought about that or read about it in that way when I was in seminary. Believe me, this was altogether new. Associations were an essential mode of belonging in the ancient world. The word association demonstrates the centrality of group belonging and activity. Collegium is a standard Latin term for the sense of colleague, collegiality, or friendship. Koinonia, another Greek word, one of the most common Greek words for association, means fellowship, partnership, or communion. So a koinonia and a collegium were two very different kinds of things. And here the authors do a little bit of linguistic work for us. Other words used to identify associations include assembly, meeting, company, fellow workers, bringing together, and all of those particular words in Latin begin with S-Y-N, and S-Y-N means witness, W-I-T-H hyphen N-E-S-S, witness. And so in a synodos, that's a synergisa, synagogue, all those words begin with the Latin S-Y-N, which means being with, being with. A word signaling essential witness at the heart of these groups. This witness, not witness, W-I-T-H hyphen N-E-S-S, together with, belonging, this witness or belonging together usually involved eating together. Club members met regularly for banquets, celebrate festivals and observance for their club god, Romans had them, to host burials for deceased members, to honor group officials and patrons, and to simply meet together and network together. Meals were so important to these clubs that often they were named dining, banquet, or supper clubs. My parents belonged to a supper club when I was a little boy. Everybody then was in a depression. They belonged to a supper club. And I was a member of their supper club. And one of my happiest memories growing up was going to supper club dinners. And different families would host them in their families, in their homes. And that's because there wasn't enough money to do anything else besides get together and have dinner. That's where it was in the early to late 30s. The club itself was referred to with the Greek word for meal. Members often required to pay club dues in support of pledging, club dues in support of these various activities, and were expected to follow certain rules of behavior. These rules for membership in these clubs varied. Some groups were exclusive to men, other clubs were exclusive to women. As these examples suggest, our knowledge of these clubs comes largely from epigraphic evidence, that is, inscriptions on stone. These people would write these clubs would write Roman clubs would write their rules on stone. And when you walked into the club meeting, you hit the stone, and by golly, you agreed to follow the rules of the club by hitting the stone as you walked into wherever the club was gathering. These inscriptions often record the rules for club activities, procedures for meals or festivals, or recognition for honors given to specific members, among other subjects. They were displayed in club meeting spaces as a reminder of the rules. The members were sometimes required to touch the stones before participating in group activities, ensuring that members kept the rules in mind while also displaying their proper conduct with other members. These are Roman groups. During the monthly and annual sacrifices, read the rules of an association based on the household of a man named Dionysius in the 2nd or 1st century BCE. May these men and women who trust themselves touch this stone on which the instructions of the god Zeus has been written, so that they may obey these instructions, and those who do not obey instructions may become evident very shortly. And I'm quite sure that probably these early Christian clubs probably had their own set of understanding and rules, along with the traditional rules that were followed in Roman families. Here are some of the rules for a Bacchus club. This is a Roman club whose god was Bacchus. In the gathering, no one is allowed to sing, cause a disturbance, or applaud. Rather, with all order and decorum, members shall, this is literally taken off a stone. Rather, in all order and decorum, shall speak and do their parts as the priest or head of the Bacchic devotees directs. None of the Iobaci, members of the club, who has not paid the contributions for either the meetings on the 9th of the month or the annual festival is permitted to enter the gathering. You can't come in until it's been decided by the priest whether they should pay the fee or are allowed to enter anyway. Now, if anyone begins a fight or is disorderly or sits in someone else's couch or insults or abuses somebody, that person abused or insulted shall produce 2 sworn witnesses, testifying they heard the insult or the abuse. The one who's committed the insult or the abuse shall pay the common treasury 25 light drachmas, or the one who is the cause of the fight shall either pay the 25 or not come to any more meetings. If someone comes to blows, the one who is struck shall file a report with the priest or vice priest, who shall without fail to convene a meeting and shall judge by vote with the priest presiding. The Bacchus was the god of wine, fertility, and partying. Okay, maybe some of you belong to a Bacchus club. Who knows? Yeah. Okay. Now here is what the club was like for followers of the Anointed. Among the benefits of club membership, lively meals, networking, the honor of serving as a priest or official, safety, group trust was of top rank. Associations are trust networks, groups bonded by norms of safety and shared expectations. By joining an association, members signal to others they are trustworthy and share the value of their peers. The rules of associations represent agreed norms of ethical behavior and embody shared values. Members could trust one another to behave properly, but more than that, to provide one another with tangible forms of support. Equal share of meals, protection from cruel heads of the household, assurance that their bodies will be properly honored after death, and protection from the gods. This form of trust, of support, was no small thing, given the precarious character of life during the first 2 centuries. Safety through group belonging made life less threatening and more livable. Understood as a trust network, Paul's charge that Chloe's people love one another made perfect sense. The whole writing about love in Corinthians was written by Paul as an injunction for the kind of rules that Chloe's group was supposed to follow. That's why it was put in there. It was put in there as Paul's sense of what belonging to Chloe's association of the anointed, Chloe's group, should do. Understood as a trust network, Paul's charge that Chloe's people love one another makes perfect sense. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels but not have love, he writes, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Make your love your aim. Earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. Paul speaks of love in the context of important group practices of prophecy, speaking in tongues. Love is about the unity of the body of the anointed. If club members try to perform these activities but their underlying trust network is broken, none of the practices work properly. You've got to trust, first of all. If you don't trust the people, you can't belong to the club. Because things in anointed clubs was far more intimate and less formal and rigid than in Roman clubs. This letter to Chloe's people, that's Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, speaks of the kind of trust of mutual belonging required for association life. Clubs were meant to be a refuge, a safe haven in precarious circumstances. Many associations were structured as chosen families. Other clubs used the language of friendship, calling each other friends or companions. Club members understood their voices to be temporary, heard only by their friends. See, we were talking about my granddaughter. In that particular part of the family, in my family, there's a certain amount of conflict that's going on right now. It's caused by a person that doesn't even know they caused it. That's complicated in a family. And this youngest granddaughter knows the story. And so talking about that story in her particular family required that she feel very confident that we were not going to go back and talk to other members of her family about what she had said. And so it was a trust network. We created the trust network in this particular breakfast by saying, this is confidential to the three people sitting here. Nobody else is going to hear this. Marilyn and I will talk about it maybe, but we're not talking about it with other people. Nothing like having rumors get spread around in families of conflict. Don't do it. You often can't fix it. You can't do anything about it. It's really hard. Club members understood their voices to be temporary, heard only by their friends. While clubs might receive an occasional letter from an emperor, recognizing impressive club honors paid him or his imperial cult, clubs operated unofficially and mostly locally. Clubs gave voice to women, to the enslaved, to rag dealers. See where they put women, the group. Clothing cleaners, basket weavers, and grave diggers. Their statues were often inscribed on stone, but they were for the use of club members only, set up inside meeting places or memorialized on a tomb or on papyrus. As records of voices of the underheard, such as a wide, diverse cross-section of ancient society, association rules and registers provides us with a more reliable picture of the 1st and 2nd century Mediterranean life than we find in the writings and histories of socially, writings from a narrow minority, fully resourced and almost entirely male perspective. Reading Paul along association records gives us a much clearer understanding of what was happening in the associations of the Lord Jesus anointed and why. Not every anointed community was an association, to be sure, but undoubtedly many anointed communities structured themselves in the form of belonging, a belonging prioritizing the group trust and social safety with us, W-I-T-H hyphen us. Now, the next chapter is kind of interesting because it talked about two of the major activities that went on in clubs. And the title of the chapter is, you ready? Feasting and Bathing. I read that, I thought to myself, what are they researching anyway? Well, let's see. Meals were the heart of the gathering of groups associated with Jesus of the Anointed. They were lush, entertaining, full of conversation, expressive, long, and embodied. Recognizing that members of these groups spent most of their time together at meal gatherings helps us understand what they stood for, how they thought of themselves, and what their core values were. The one thing that unified all these groups of this movement was they regularly dined with each other. So supper clubs is, I think, a good way of thinking about these experimental Jesus groups, the chosen groups that were supper clubs. Eating was a very big part of it. And maybe that's why we still have coffee hours. Could be. Some coffee hours, I've been in a lot of coffee hours. Some coffee hours are really pretty dull. Some coffee hours can be very interesting. And I always enjoyed it when you had forums over in your parish hall there, because people could either be out there eating and drinking coffee, or they could go and sit in the forum, or they could listen drinking coffee to what was going on in the forum. So I miss that here. I miss coffee on the one hand and forum on the other, and people going back and forth between permeable boundaries, you might say. But we don't have that here. Something else is happening over there. I'm not sure I know what that is, but okay, feasting, 182. Mediterranean people in general intentionally exaggerated the importance of relaxation and ease as they ate together. They took their time to enjoy their food and wine. Joyful celebrations were foundational, even in the midst of the tensions of life under the empire. Although research indicates that these early groups of Jesus people had exuberant and jubilant meals, as a conversation, it is not always sweetness and light. Fierce arguments as well as shortages of food were well known. A lot of arguments, and we're going to hear this a little later on this morning, a lot of the arguments had to do with what kind of beliefs you were choosing for yourself. And that's a chapter called heresy. The word heresy refers to a Greek word, choice. So when you're a heretic, you have chosen what to believe. You're not following the doctrine of the association or the denomination or whatever. They took their time to enjoy their food and wine. Joyful celebration was foundational, even in the midst of the tension of life under the empire. Although research indicates that these early groups of Jesus people had exuberant and jubilant meals as a conversation, it is not always sweetness and light. Fierce arguments as well as shortages of food were well known. Other groups besides Jesus people gathered and acted in a similar way, reclining, drinking, singing, discussing, and arguing. Members of extended families or neighborhood groups, workers such as carpenters, shipbuilders, and bricklayers, and members of various religious groups shared meals as a regular practice. Associations and clubs of various types hosted each other's meals. So it is important dining. So important was dining in the 1st and 2nd centuries that it was defining for most people. Reclining while eating expressed the significance of leisure and ease. You didn't sit at a table, you lay down on a couch, so it was very relaxing and easy. Greeks who began this style of feasting a century before insisted that the meal expressed equality. Initially, equality found expression only in the wealthy, free Greek males. But in the 1st century, however, enslaved women and other ethnicities was often a matter of principle rather than practice. This participation became an inherent principle of the communities of the anointed. So they all lay down and they ate together. They all lay down and ate together. Where do we come to bathing? Key to the present book's larger understanding that groups gathered regularly for communal meals. The first 200 years after Jesus are unintelligible without these vigorous and intense gatherings at meals. The broad differences between meals portrays what we have explored. Also begun to show that such meals both held many differences together and also encouraged a great variety of ideas and expressions. Bathing. When you read baptism in the text in Scripture, it can often refer to bathing and instead of what you do with that piece of furniture right over yonder. See, when you think about baptisms, you assume that that's what was going on when they talked about bathing, because you're reading the present experience back into there. But it wasn't that way. A lot of bathing was going on, not between males and females, but in different gender groups. A lot of bathing was going on as an extension of sharing meals together, a way of relaxing and a way of, to some extent, demonstrating ritual cleansing, but not necessarily baptism, because there was not a group to be baptized into. It wasn't an institution. It wasn't something that somebody formally chose to belong to. It was something that you belonged to because you were part of a supper club. Not nearly as regularly, but just as expressively as the meals, most Jesus-related groups practiced bathing as a part of their life together. The joy of bathing ran deep alongside the joy of feasting. We know most about bathing practices connected to the people of Israel who lived all around the Mediterranean. Stories of Jesus bathing with others is found throughout the diverse writings of these clubs and groups. Acts of the Apostles has 10 different stories that make direct reference to Judean-like bathing outside of geographical Israel. It's something that early followers of Jesus inherited as a practice of Israel, and because many of them had formerly been Hebrews, they practiced it as followers of the Anointed. Especially in Acts, these bathings are mistakenly translated baptism and take on the meaning of being a Christian, ritual associated with being a Christian. This imposes a later Christian meaning on practices of bathing by the communities of the Anointed. So that's part of not reading history backward, and taking baptism now to be the same thing as what's talked about in bathing in the New Testament. Bathing was one thing then, baptism is something different. There apparently was not an institution to belong to. You belonged to a club, a supper club, that also enjoyed bathing. Bathing events, ritual was a major aspect of ordinary daily life. Social bathing took on a variety of meanings, rooted in the importance of cleaning oneself. Metaphorically, bathing became a sign of moral cleanliness, purity of heart and mind, differentiating the bathers from corruption in many forms. People washed themselves regularly of such physical, moral, and attitudinal and social dirtiness. Since bathing was social, a variety of different types of uncleanliness could be present. Many bathers had minor regrets and worries. Others needed to recuperate from dirty or humiliating work. Still others were experiencing significant pain and only needed to wash their bodies. Bathing events involve group reflection, small talk, silence, joy, ponderings, prayer, and social telling. They mixed losses and wounds with relaxation, comfort, social give and take, and the sensuousness of water. There's also a sense of release, lamentation, and long-term resolve. The first century historian Josephus wrote of washings by John the Baptist, whom we traditionally know as John the Bather, whom we typically call John the Baptist, were that a consecration of the body implying the soul was already thoroughly cleansed by right behavior, meaning that those who bathed were committed to leading righteous life, to practicing justice towards their friends, piety towards God. One special occasion when one was washing one's past life as a person, they became intentionally known as a new way of life. So part of the bathing ritual for these Jesus clubs, differentiating male and female, was a form of moral cleanliness and moral washing from the regrets and errors of the past. I don't think about that when I take a shower generally, but maybe I should think more about that. It's not a bad practice, I don't think, at all. Okay. Both bathing and communal eating practices of the Jesus groups during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era were important community activities. The bathing practices in particular had a strong effect across broad swaths of these communities as people strove against imperial pressure. So they were struggling, these early associations and members of them were struggling against the context of the Roman Empire with all its violence and conquering. They were struggling in tension with what was the prevalent cultural environment in which they lived. Remember earlier on, I talked a lot about the Roman Empire and what a violent place it was. It enslaved people. People were slaves. They were barbarians. And these Jesus groups gradually began to form up and took all these excluded people in and gave them a sense of belonging that the Roman system would not give them. It wasn't in the cards, so to speak. Both bathing and communal eating practices of Jesus groups during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era were important community activities. The bathing practices in particular had a strong effect across broad swaths of these communities as people strove against imperial pressure. Both of these practices healed and energized otherwise broken people and relationships, providing them with a sense of belonging to a safe community. Anybody had any questions up to this point? I should perhaps ask some more questions.
You've stunned them into stupor.
Okay.
No questions online. We have about 10 people with us online, but nobody's put a question in. Anybody have a question in the room? I'll bring you the mic.
Yeah. You can see that what we're doing is we're working more and more on the growing distinctions between the culture of the Roman Empire, which was violent, enslaving, conquering, and pretty elitist oriented. And on the other hand, these anointed Jesus groups who were being chosen in contrast to the traditional Roman families and had within their behavior, their behavior, a very different way of being together, sharing meals, helping people who were broken to become whole again, and it was a normal and natural offshoot of what I would call the ethic of Jesus, and that was gradually being talked about a great deal. And so, chapter 13 has to do with inventing orthodoxy through heresy. Inventing orthodoxy through heresy. And basically what this chapter is doing is it's talking about the ways in which conversations and understandings about Jesus in these anointed groups gradually grew into schools of thought about Jesus, very different points of view. In the final chapter we're going to be looking at is something called Gnosticism. And I won't even try and read to you from that chapter. It's too complicated for me to understand, really. But Gnosticism is now, I learned in seminary back in the day, that Gnosticism was a heresy. But rather, this particular book talks about Gnosticism not so much as a belief system, but as a way to understand the contrast between darkness and light. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, and it's a whole body of writings that were discovered in Western Egypt. I think 1953, something like that. No, okay. Origins of heresy. We're doing okay, I think. The English word heresy is a translation of the Greek word haresis, meaning choice. Well, when I was in seminary, heresy was something to be avoided, and orthodoxy was something to be cohered to. I think that distinction is weakening in our time. I think the decline in what I would call institutional religion is giving people permission to think more freely about their sense of religious and spiritual convictions. I can hardly get people to talk about religion. In my family, it's almost a subject you can't talk about. And it's very hard to talk about religion because I think it's too deep and too personal, and many people are not even aware of what they are choosing in terms of their religious or spiritual understandings. As a priest, I spent a lot of my own many years just kind of thinking about heresy and thinking about what I believe and bringing what I understand to terms with, to bring into relationship with my own experience. I spent a lot of my own personal interior thought time wondering about what I've been taught and what in seminary and what I am learning as a result of my ongoing experience. So I think a lot about belief, and I don't share a lot of it. When I shared earlier the difference between Are you saved by what you do in life or what you saved by what you do in death? And I said, it's basically the same thing. Basically the same thing. And that's a fairly recent thought I've had, and I'm working on it. I haven't heard that thought before, but I'm working on it. When you get to be 90, you work on things like that. Better work on things like that. You're going to spend a long time working on it without any kind of options. What's there is there. And the only difference between heaven and hell is whether you like what you get. And so, I came to believe some time ago, that I want to be the kind of person in life that will enjoy what I think my experience in death is going to be. You got to get used to it. It doesn't come naturally, I hate to tell you. The English word heresy is a transliteration of the Greek word heresis, meaning choice, particularly intellectual choice. It often refers to the teachings of Greek philosophical schools or to those who follow a particular school or system of thought, with the common translation party or more negatively faction. The Acts of the Apostles uses this term precisely in this way. But the high priest rose up and all were with him, and the party, the hereses of the Sadducees. This could be easily translated as school or philosophy. So this is precisely the way the first century Judean historian Josephus uses this word in describing the four schools or philosophies of the first century of Israel. The sense of heresis as an intellectual choice or school remained dominant through most of the second century, so that there were different schools of understanding Jesus, for example. You probably call it theology, but if you take the term theology and think about orthodoxy and read backward into history and place that on top of the first two centuries, it's a mistake, because there wasn't any orthodoxy. There were different schools of thinking about Jesus, either formal intellectual schools of thought or just conversations within club groups. What have you heard about Jesus? How do we understand him? All kinds of questions. And Gnosticism, the Gnostic point of view, was just one of those schools of thought. It wasn't thought about being a heresy at the time that these writings were being propagated. The sense of heresis as an intellectual choice or school remained dominant through most of the second centuries. The strong negative sense of heresy becomes evident only in the late second century, and that's why you have an institution, you have bishops, you have a point of view that bishops are supposed to propagate and follow. Anybody here remember James Albert Pike? Pike was labeled a heretic before he died in the Judean desert, because he had been led in a particular direction, and I'm advocating for, I was ordained by him. I don't know what that means, particularly. Pike was a person who at one point in his life as a bishop, the Bishop of California, was probably steeped in orthodox or correct thinking, but he somehow slid off the side of what you call institutional religion, read bishop, and gradually became more and more his own person, and in doing so had thoughts that were very different than the ones that bishops are supposed to have. And so I was, obviously he ordained me, I was alive and well at the time of his episcopacy. And I watched him and followed him. I even heard him preach at Grace Cathedral several times, and I sat and wondered, what on earth is he thinking about? Because I was in seminary, and you weren't supposed to think things like that. I wish now I'd written down what he said, and I would probably think about them. I don't know. So we're thinking about heresy. The word forward is to reject the either-or of heresy versus orthodoxy. The creation of the first two centuries later centuries took on evidence from the first two centuries without prejudice as a predetermined outcome. Where do these different teachings come from? The significance of philosophical schools as a primary social environment for the development of teachings in the early Jesus movement is often overlooked. So apparently these schools of thought were, in some cases, were actually Jesus clubs themselves, or Jesus clubs had that particular some Jesus clubs had that particular way of discussing and debating among themselves, what do you make of Jesus? Because the first few centuries were not handed the orthodoxy that we take for granted. They had to work on it. They were handed people like Paul who worked very hard on it. And, okay, yeah, all right. Yeah. Thus, the internal dynamics of schools of competition between different teachers and the desire of students to become teachers gave rise to new teachings and new schools supporting their teachings. The schools and their teachers were a driving force in a dynamic movement, creating difference within the movement. And he quotes a bishop named Irenaeus, who was very involved with trying to think about what was proper to think about and the proper way to think about it. Significantly, the inter-schools debates about teaching arose not from theological issues like the oneness of God, but from the actual practices of the communities of the anointed. So the members of these clubs would look at what we're doing here, and they would begin to think about what does our activity mean, and how does this activity relate to how we think about Jesus? And that's the way early theology began to be developed, a very natural and normal way to think about things. This should not be surprising, as Jesus' movement, just like the Judean movement, was more about correct practice than correct belief. So they were more concerned about whether our clubs are functioning according to our club rules than they are thinking about theology, about the Trinity or the Incarnation or some of the essential theological categories that we think about now. What unified both movements was practice. It was the practice that held these groups together. And they debated and felt free to debate all kinds of understandings about whether these practices conform to Jesus and what Jesus was about and whether he was real or not even. This is not the 20th century, first 2 centuries, without any kind of institutional form of practice or belief. It was Wild West, theological Wild West. What unified both movements was practice. On the road to Christianity in the 3rd and 4th century, that relationship was reversed. And so 3rd and 4th centuries were centuries trying to get belief together in a coherent form. The Council of Nicaea, for example, of 325, that was the first formal council of all the leaders across Roman Christendom. And it was getting to be Christendom at that point, by the Council of Nicaea. You wouldn't have had a Council of Nicaea if it had been thought about as Christendom. Throughout the 1st and 2nd century, we see not only a great deal of diversity, but fluidity and experimentation in all aspects of the life of the communities of the Jesus movement. Members of the early Jesus communities grew up within greater Israel and identified with Israel's tradition. Israel had long dealt with the diversity of orthodoxy or orthopraxy, that is, by correct practice and not correct teaching. You get the practice right, it's more important than the teaching. And that was pretty prevalent, I think, within the Hebrew tradition. But that tradition, remember, gets broken by the first 2 centuries before Jesus with the introduction of Greek ways of thinking about things in a more systemic way. And that's the world that Jesus was born into. That was how he understood himself as a result of his cultural environment. And how Jesus understood himself became the subject of discussions in after Jesus, before Christianity. So you can kind of see the way the crucible experience carried over into the way Jesus thought about himself, and then stories about how Jesus was and thought about himself that had to be made sense of by the first 200 years of after Jesus. We have seen how horesis, which means choice and by extension school, shifts from a neutral term to an indication of division and finally a negative term where one school excludes another. So it began with choice, but then some choices were thought to be less desirable than others, and that's where you got conflict in choices. That's referred to by heresy. But as categories, heresy and orthodoxy, false teaching versus true teaching, obscure our understanding of the first 2 centuries. In this period, two categories are anachronistic and read the future into the past. The real situation is more complex and calls for a more radical solution. The categories themselves need to disappear. The situation is fluid, exhibiting a great deal of experimentation. We do not have heresy and orthodoxy in competition, but a whole series of schools and teachers engage in interacting in conversation, debate, and experimentation. Only toward the end of the second centuries did things get settled out, and then only tentatively. It's still tentative, I can tell you. Well, I think I'm 10 after 10. I think, Mr. Rector, I'd better call it a day. And I'm not doing much about Gnosticism because it's a complicated chapter,
Because you don't know.
which I don't know about.
See, this is a joke.
I'm not a Gnostic, I don't know.
There you go. Good theology jokes. Thank you, John, very much. Any questions for John before we finish up today?
I'll be waiting outside. If you have something you want to ask about or wonder about or debate about, I'm happy to listen.
Wonderful.
Okay, good.
Couple notes. Next Sunday is the fifth Sunday of the month, so we have one service next Sunday, one service at 9:30 in here. That means the forum will still happen next Sunday, but will follow the service. So forum will happen 10:45 or so, and next Sunday's forum is the concluding forum of this series, of this After Jesus, Before Christianity series with John. But John's not done yet, because immediately following this series, John will sort of make, as John's talked about this series has really focused on the cultural milieu of the first couple centuries of the Jesus movement. Well, there's a lot of cultural milieu, and maybe mildew, happening in these current centuries of the church as well. And so as John spoke about a couple years ago, he'll be doing a forum about the contemporary changes in our culture and our church and the transitions happening in our life of faith together. So that will immediately follow this forum series, which again concludes next week, and then we'll launch into that. John, you want to say anything about that?
Before the congregation ever heard of Aaron, there was a kind of a pause. There was quite a pause, and I think it was Kathy. You were the one that asked me to do something, and it was early Zoom, and Zoom was just being invented, and so I did a three-part series that followed the outline of a book called Transitions. You maybe have. I've encouraged transitions. I'm bringing transitions back. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the process of a transition, which is described in this book. And then I'm going to be looking at a mega version of transition, which has occurred. The ending of what we had before was probably during World War I, 1916, and we've had a long ending between 1916 and I think Hiroshima, and when you're through with an ending, when an ending has been completed, you've got a neutral zone where you're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. That's where we are. We're in one, and so I'm going to be talking for 3 Sundays about a mega transition that has occurred probably from 1400 into the present time. It's a big thought. But unless you know what your cultural environment is, you don't maybe know where you are.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. And then last thing I want to tell you, if you can hold one more piece of information in your head, is that following that series on transitions, Robin and some of the other folks who are going to be leading our diocese in our Episcopal Church's General Convention, which is happening this summer, will have a week or two about General Convention. So you, as a parish, will know what issues are being discussed as our church gathers together as a whole this year in Baltimore in July. So that's coming later in June, but you know what's happening before that. If you're headed home, have a great rest of your day. If you're getting ready for the 10:30 service, go grab a cup of coffee, and we'll see you back here in just a few minutes.